Before you get the name, before you get the company, before you get the empire, picture a boy. 8 years old. Arkansas. The kind of place where the roads turn to mud when it rains and the air in summer sits on you like a wet blanket. This boy isn't thinking about college, isn't thinking about business school, isn't thinking about legacy. He's thinking about surviving the week. He left school after the 7th grade. Not because he wanted to. Because there was a sawmill, and his uncle needed help, and help was something this family could not afford to refuse. That boy was Johnny Bryan Hunt. Born February 28, 1927, near Haber Springs, in Cleburne County, Arkansas. And the story of what he built, what he fundamentally changed, is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories in the history of American commerce. Here is the thing about J.B. Hunt that most people outside the freight world don't fully understand. He didn't just start a trucking company. He didn't just grow it big. He took two industries that had been living in completely separate worlds, trucking on one side, railroads on the other, and forced them to work together in a way nobody had ever seriously committed to before. And in doing that, he rewired the basic logic of how goods move across this country. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because to understand what he built, you have to go back to where he started. And where he started is about as far from a boardroom as you can get. Cleburne County in the 1920s was not a place of abundance. This was rural Arkansas during the years leading into the Great Depression, and if you were a working family there, every day was already its own quiet emergency. Hunt grew up in that environment, not as backdrop, not as color, but as the defining force of his early life. When your childhood teaches you that there is no safety net, that no one is coming to rescue you, that the only variable you can actually control is how hard you work today, that lesson does not leave. It becomes the operating system. He left school, he went to the sawmill, and he worked. That's the beginning. No romance in it, no inspirational poster version of poverty. Just a kid doing hard physical labor because that was the reality he was born into. After the sawmill came other work. He picked cotton. He sold lumber. He drove trucks. He served in the United States Army, came back in 1947, and tried his hand at running a livestock sale barn as his first real business venture. That business did not make it. He sold it and went back to driving trucks for regional carriers, spending the next several years behind the wheel, moving freight across the South and learning, by sheer immersion, exactly how the transportation business worked from the ground up. This is a detail worth slowing down for. Because most founders of large companies come into their industry from the outside. They study it, they analyze it, they hire consultants to explain it to them. Hunt came into trucking from inside the cab. He knew what it felt like to push through the night with a heavy load and a tight delivery window. He knew what broke down, what was inefficient, where the real costs piled up. He didn't learn this from a report. He lived it. And that is not a minor distinction. That is the whole difference between someone who understands an industry on paper and someone who understands it in their bones. In 1952, he married Janelle DeBusk. It was a partnership that would prove to be foundational, not just personally, but commercially. Because when the first real business opportunity arrived, it was something they would build together. Now here is where the story takes a turn that seems almost deliberately absurd, if you didn't know what it was building toward. In 1961, Johnny Bryan Hunt and his wife Janelle founded a company in Stuttgart, Arkansas. And what did they sell? What was the product? Rice hulls. The byproduct of rice milling, the dry, fibrous outer shell of the grain, mostly considered agricultural waste. They sold it as poultry litter, bedding material for chicken farms. $3,000 was the initial investment. That was everything. A 34-year-old man with no formal education, no inherited wealth, no venture capital, no connections to the financial world, putting $3,000 into a business selling rice hulls in Arkansas. And the first year? They lost over $20,000. Most people would have stopped right there. Most people would have taken that loss as the market delivering a verdict and walked away. Hunt did not walk away. He adjusted, he pushed, he kept moving, and eventually the rice hull business turned around so completely that it became the largest producer of poultry litter in the world. Read that sentence again. The world's largest producer of poultry litter. A business that started with $3,000 and a $20,000 loss in year one. What that tells you about Johnny Bryan Hunt is not just that he was resilient. It tells you that he had an unusual relationship with failure. He did not experience it as a verdict. He experienced it as data. But rice hulls were never the destination. They were the classroom. Because alongside the rice hull business, something else was happening, the kind of thing that, in retrospect, looks inevitable, but at the time probably just looked like a practical necessity. To move rice hulls, you need trucks. And in 1969, Hunt purchased 5 tractors and 7 trailers to handle transportation for his own operation. He relocated the whole business to northwest Arkansas, to the area around Lowell and Fayetteville, to focus on growth. What started as a support function, a logistical tool for moving his own product, began to reveal itself as something much larger. Because once you are running trucks, you start to see the whole game differently. You see how routes work. You see where time gets wasted. You see what clients actually need versus what the industry has been offering them. You see where money drips through the cracks, load by load, mile by mile. And Hunt, who had already spent years behind the wheel before he ever owned a truck, saw all of this with unusual clarity. The rice hull business had been his business school. 5 trucks and 7 trailers was his graduate program. And the industry he was entering, long-haul trucking in America, was about to enter a period of tremendous change. The 1970s in America were complicated in every way. Economically, politically, socially, very little was stable. But through all of it, goods still had to move. Products still had to get from manufacturers to warehouses to stores to consumers. Freight does not stop for inflation, or oil shocks, or political crises. And the companies that could figure out how to move freight reliably, efficiently, and at a competitive cost, those were the companies that would matter. Hunt's trucking operation grew through this decade steadily and deliberately. Not flashy, not overnight, but methodical. He was watching costs, watching routes, watching utilization, thinking about the fleet not just as a collection of vehicles but as a system that either produced returns or burned them. This distinction, treating transportation as a managed system rather than a collection of individual transactions, was not universal in the industry at the time. A lot of operators were running on instinct and momentum. Hunt was running on something closer to operational logic. He also carried something that most executives climbing the corporate ladder never carry. He knew what his drivers were experiencing. He had been them. And that knowledge informed how he structured operations, how he thought about scheduling, how he thought about the human equation inside the machine. A driver who is treated as a variable cost is a different driver than one who is treated as a professional. Hunt understood this not as a management philosophy but as a lived fact. By the end of the 70s, J.B. Hunt Transport was no longer a sideline. It was the main event. The rice hull operation was still running, but the trucking business had taken on its own momentum, its own identity, its own gravitational pull toward something bigger. And the next decade would prove just how big that could get. The 1980s arrived in America like a gear shift. Deregulation was reshaping entire industries, airlines, banking, and yes, trucking. The Staggers Rail Act of 1980 had already started loosening the regulatory stranglehold on railroads, giving them more freedom to set competitive rates. The Motor Carrier Act of 1980 did the same for trucking. Suddenly, the rules of the game were changing fast, and the companies that had spent years quietly building operational muscle were in the best possible position to press the advantage. J.B. Hunt Transport was one of those companies. By 1983, the business had grown from 5 used trucks and 7 trailers into the 80th largest trucking firm in the United States. Stop and think about that number. The 80th largest. In a country full of carriers, regional operators, and long-established national giants, a self-educated man from Cleburne County, Arkansas, had built something that belonged in that conversation. The company went public in 1983, listing on the stock exchange and signaling to the market that this was not a regional success story but a national force in motion. The IPO was not a finish line. It was fuel. Capital from the public markets meant Hunt could accelerate, more trucks, more lanes, more capacity. And accelerate he did. Through the mid-1980s, J.B. Hunt Transport expanded at a pace that made competitors take notice. The fleet grew. The routes extended. The revenue climbed. By the mid-80s, the company had become one of the largest truckload carriers in the entire country. But here is where the story gets interesting in a way that most people don't anticipate. Growth, in the trucking business, creates its own problems. Not problems of failure, problems of physics. The more you scale pure over-the-road trucking, the more clearly you see its structural limitations. And Hunt, because he was not just an operator but a systems thinker, saw those limitations with increasing clarity the bigger his company got. Think about what long-haul trucking actually involves. A tractor and trailer. A driver behind the wheel. Thousands of miles of interstate highway. Diesel fuel. Time. Every one of those elements costs money, and every one of them has a ceiling on how efficient it can realistically get. You can optimize your routes. You can invest in better fuel economy. You can streamline your dispatch. But at a certain point, you have done everything a purely road-based model allows you to do. The physics of a truck, one driver, one load, rolling down a highway, simply cannot compete with the economics of a train moving hundreds of containers at once over the same distance. Hunt knew this. Not as a theory. As a business problem he was living inside. There was another layer to it. The 1980s were also a period of serious driver shortage pressure. Long-haul truck driving is hard work. Extended time away from home. Irregular schedules. Physical toll. The industry had always struggled to attract and retain enough drivers to meet freight demand, and as volumes grew, that squeeze got tighter. Every mile a truck covered that a train could have covered instead was a mile spent burning driver hours and diesel, two resources that were increasingly constrained and increasingly expensive. And then there was the question of pure distance economics. Moving freight from Los Angeles to Chicago is roughly 2,000 miles. On a truck, that is multiple drivers, multiple days, a significant fuel cost, and a compressed margin by the end. On a train, that same distance is dramatically cheaper per ton-mile. Railroads had always known this. Truckers had always known this. The problem was that for most of the 20th century, the two industries had existed in parallel universes, separate systems, separate cultures, separate infrastructure, with very little genuine cooperation between them. This is the critical point that the story of J.B. Hunt keeps coming back to. Not that intermodal was a new concept. Trailer on flatcar service, what railroaders called piggyback, had existed in various forms since the 1950s. By 1958, more than 32 railroads were offering some version of it. The technology was not a secret. The basic logic was not mysterious. Moving a truck trailer on a railcar for the long-distance portion of a journey and then putting it back on the road for final delivery, this was not a difficult idea to understand. The reason it had never become a mainstream, dominant model was something different entirely. It was cultural. It was organizational. It was the deep institutional resistance that builds up between two industries that have spent decades competing for the same freight dollar and have never had serious reason to trust each other. Truckers saw railroads as slow, inflexible, and indifferent to customer needs. Railroads looked at truckers as the competition that had been eating their lunch since the interstate highway system was built in the 1950s. They were not enemies exactly, but they were certainly not natural partners. Every time someone suggested that maybe trucks and trains should work together more closely, the conversation tended to die in a room full of people who had very different ideas about whose system was in charge. Hunt was not interested in that argument. He was interested in the math. And the math, by the middle of the 1980s, was becoming impossible to ignore. For any haul longer than approximately 500 miles, rail was significantly more cost-efficient than highway. The fuel cost per ton-mile on a train is a fraction of what it costs on a truck. The infrastructure already existed, thousands of miles of rail network stretching across the country, much of it underutilized for domestic freight in the ways that trucking companies might care about. What the system lacked was not the physical capability. What it lacked was the commercial architecture, the right contractual framework, the right operational coordination, the right business model, to make trucks and trains function as a single seamless service rather than two separate industries handing freight awkwardly between them. That architecture was what Hunt set out to build. He began pushing the concept internally. The vision was not complicated on the surface. Use trucks for pickup and delivery, the first and last leg of the journey where flexibility and door-to-door capability matter. Use rail for the long middle, the high-mileage backbone of the trip where the train's economics are overwhelming. Marry the two into a service that looked to the shipper like a single integrated offering, not a complicated handoff between two different companies with two different tracking systems and two different sets of excuses when something went wrong. What made this hard was not the idea. What made it hard was the execution. And more than the execution, what made it truly hard was the partnership question. Because you cannot run an intermodal model by yourself. You need a railroad to say yes. You need a railroad that is willing to invest in the terminal infrastructure, align its scheduling around the trucking operation, price its services in a way that makes the combined model commercially viable, and, perhaps most importantly, treat a trucking company as a genuine strategic partner rather than a customer to be managed at arm's length. That partner was not easy to find. And the conversations that preceded the eventual breakthrough were not quick or smooth. There was resistance on the railroad side. There were executives who saw this as trucking trying to take control of something it did not understand. There were legitimate operational questions about how containers would be tracked, how schedules would be synchronized, how liability would be handled when a shipment moved across two entirely different operational systems. Hunt pushed through all of it. Because he had done the math. And the math said this was right. The moment of breakthrough came in 1989, and it came through a partnership that would change American logistics permanently. J.B. Hunt Transport reached a landmark agreement with the Atchison, Topeka and Santa Fe Railway, commonly known as Santa Fe Railway, to launch a door-to-door intermodal service. The man on the railroad side of that deal was Mike Haverty, then the president of Santa Fe Railway. Years later, both Hunt and Haverty would be recognized by the Intermodal Transportation Institute as founding fathers of the modern truck-rail intermodal model. This was not a pilot program. This was not a test. This was a commercial commitment, a real service, marketed to real shippers, built on a shared infrastructure and a shared belief that the future of freight in America ran on both steel rails and rubber tires, not one or the other. The industry watched. Some competitors were skeptical. Others were curious. The people who understood the economics best were probably the most unsettled, because they could see immediately that if this worked, if Hunt and Santa Fe could actually deliver on the promise of a seamless truck-rail service at competitive prices, the whole cost structure of long-haul freight in America was going to have to be renegotiated. They were right. But getting it to actually work was a different kind of war entirely. A signed agreement is not a working system. A handshake between two industries that have spent decades not trusting each other is not, by itself, a revolution. It is a starting point. And starting points, especially in industries built on physical infrastructure and deeply ingrained habit, are almost always harder than the vision that preceded them. The 1989 partnership between J.B. Hunt and Santa Fe Railway was real. The ambition behind it was real. But the moment it moved from the conference room to the actual freight terminal, the complexity hit like a wall. Think about what intermodal actually requires at the operational level. You need containers, standardized metal boxes that can be lifted off a truck chassis, stacked on a rail car, and picked up cleanly at the other end without damage or delay. You need terminal facilities, the physical yards where trucks arrive, containers are craned off and loaded onto trains, trains depart on schedule, and at the destination and the whole sequence runs in reverse. You need scheduling that actually aligns. A truck that arrives at a terminal with a container has to meet a train that is actually there, not one that left 3 hours ago or will not arrive until tomorrow morning. You need a tracking system that tells the shipper where their freight is at any given moment, because a shipper who cannot see their cargo is a shipper who will quickly find another carrier. And you need all of this to function not occasionally, not under ideal conditions, but consistently, reliably, and at scale, because in freight, one bad experience can undo months of earned trust. None of these pieces were simply sitting there waiting to be assembled. Terminal infrastructure had to be developed and expanded. The existing rail terminals that handled trailer-on-flat car service were not designed for the volume or the velocity that a commercial truck-rail intermodal business required. Hunt and Santa Fe had to invest in upgrading facilities, acquiring equipment, and building the physical capacity that the service needed to be credible. The scheduling alignment alone was a significant operational puzzle. Railroads run on timetables built around their own freight priorities, their own track utilization, their own network logic. Trucking companies run on the customer's schedule. The shipper needs the freight delivered by a certain time and the carrier figures out how to make that happen. Merging those two operational cultures, where one side thinks in terms of scheduled train departures and the other thinks in terms of customer delivery windows, required a level of coordination that neither industry had ever seriously attempted at this scale. There were also the inevitable early failures. Containers that missed their train slots. Deliveries that arrived later than promised. Customer complaints. Instances where the combined system, with its extra handoffs and coordination requirements, produced less reliability than a simple direct truck would have. Every one of those failures fed the skeptics who had been saying from the beginning that this was too complicated, that trucks and trains would never truly work together efficiently, that the frictions between two separate industries were simply too deep to overcome at a commercial level. Hunt heard all of it. And he kept going. This is the part of the story that distinguishes a real industry builder from someone who had a good idea. The idea was not the hard part. Holding the line through the execution, through the operational failures, through the customer complaints, through the competitive pressure from carriers who were still running pure over the road and pointing to every intermodal misstep as evidence that the whole concept was flawed, that was the hard part. Hunt's confidence through this period was not stubbornness. It was anchored in something specific. He had done the economics. He understood, at a level that went beyond optimism, that the cost structure of intermodal over long distances was fundamentally better than the cost structure of pure highway freight. That was not going to change because of early operational problems. The early operational problems were solvable. The underlying economics were structural. There is a useful distinction here that gets lost in most business stories. There is short-term performance, which can be bad for many legitimate reasons. And there is long-term structural advantage, which survives short-term performance. Hunt was managing through the gap between those two things, absorbing the short-term turbulence because he could see clearly that the structural advantage was real, durable, and growing. On the shipper side, there was education to be done. The people responsible for moving freight for major manufacturers and retailers had spent their careers working within a certain logic: hire a trucker, truck moves the freight, freight arrives. The idea of a combined service, with a container that rides on a truck for part of the journey and a train for the rest, required them to think differently about their supply chains. It required them to trust a new kind of promise. And trust, in freight, is everything. A shipper's reputation with their own customers depends on product arriving on time, in good condition, without drama. Asking them to try a new model, one that introduced more handoffs, more coordination requirements, more variables, was asking them to take on risk. Hunt's team had to sell not just the concept but the conviction. This is going to work. The savings are real. The reliability will be there. Give us the chance to prove it. Some shippers tried it. The ones who did found that over time, as the operational systems matured and the coordination between Hunt and Santa Fe improved, the service began to deliver on its promise. Costs came down on long-haul lanes. Transit times were competitive. The nightmare scenarios that the skeptics had predicted, containers lost in the system, catastrophic delays, service failures at scale, did not materialize as the norm. And then something started to happen that tends to happen in markets when a new model genuinely works. Others started paying attention. Competitors who had been watching Hunt's intermodal experiment from the sidelines began running their own calculations. If Hunt's numbers were right, if rail genuinely provided that level of cost advantage over long-haul highway, then any carrier not building railroad relationships was, over time, going to be at a structural cost disadvantage. That was not a comfortable place to sit. Gradually, other large trucking companies began approaching railroads about their own intermodal partnerships. The railroads, for their part, began to recognize what was in front of them. For decades, railroads had been losing domestic freight market share to trucks. The interstate highway system had fundamentally shifted the competitive balance, and railroads had spent much of the post-war period retrenching, cutting routes, shrinking networks, focusing on commodities like coal and grain where they had irreplaceable advantages. The Hunt partnership with Santa Fe was showing them something different. There was a way to compete for the kind of freight that trucks had been dominating: general merchandise, manufactured goods, retail supply chain, without competing against trucks. Instead, by partnering with trucks. By being part of the same system. This was a cognitive shift for the railroad industry. And it would not have happened without someone on the trucking side being willing to go first and make the model real. That someone was Hunt. By the early 1990s, the intermodal business at J.B. Hunt was no longer an experiment. It was a growing, demonstrable, commercially validated business line. The volume of containers moving through the Hunt Santa Fe system increased year on year. The operational systems improved. The customer base expanded. And the financial argument for intermodal, the argument that Hunt had been making since before anyone else was really listening, was now visible in the company's results in a way that no analyst or competitor could dismiss. The freight industry was watching a new standard being built, one container at a time. And the man who had started it all by working in a sawmill at the age of 11 was not done yet. Not even close. There is a moment in the life of any genuine innovation when it stops being a bet and starts being the baseline. When the people who resisted it quietly stop arguing and start copying it. When the trade publications stop calling it experimental and start calling it standard practice. When the question shifts from "will this work?" to "how did anyone do business without this?" That moment arrived for intermodal freight in America, and J.B. Hunt was the reason it arrived when it did. Through the early 1990s, the intermodal model that Hunt and Santa Fe Railway had built together began to attract volume at a rate that surprised even some of the people inside the company. The economics were simply too compelling for shippers to ignore once the service reliability was established. On any lane longer than 500 miles, Chicago to Dallas, Los Angeles to Chicago, Atlanta to New York, the math of combining rail's long-haul efficiency with trucks' door-to-door flexibility was dramatically better than highway-only movement. The cost savings were real. The transit times were competitive. And the environmental argument, though not the primary commercial driver in those years, was becoming increasingly relevant. Moving freight by rail produces significantly less carbon per ton-mile than moving it by truck. J.B. Hunt's intermodal segment grew into the core of the company. Not a side business. Not a pilot program that had survived longer than expected. The core. The engine. The thing that defined what J.B. Hunt Transport actually was in the American freight market. And as it grew, the industry followed. Other major truckload carriers built their own railroad partnerships. The Union Pacific, the BNSF, CSX, Norfolk Southern, The major Class I railroads all developed intermodal operations that were substantially larger and more commercially sophisticated than anything they had attempted before the Hunt model proved the concept. Entire new terminal infrastructures were built. New container fleets were assembled. New technology was developed to track containers, manage handoffs, and give shippers the visibility they needed to trust a multimodal supply chain. The word intermodal, which had been a niche technical term inside a narrow slice of the transportation industry, became a mainstream logistics concept. Every major shipper in America, every large retailer, every manufacturer moving goods across long distances, every company managing a serious supply chain, had intermodal somewhere in their freight strategy. None of that would have happened on the timeline it happened without Hunt making the first real commercial commitment and holding it through the years when it was still unproven. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Because there is a version of this story where intermodal develops anyway, where eventually, some combination of economic pressure and technological improvement forces the trucking and railroad industries to cooperate more deeply. History does not have a strict requirement for individual heroes. But the pace at which an innovation becomes standard matters enormously. A supply chain model that might have taken 20 or 30 years to become mainstream arrived in 10 years, or less, because one company with one decisive leader was willing to absorb the early risk and do the hard operational work of making it real. Every shipper who benefited from lower freight costs because of intermodal's rise, every manufacturer whose supply chain became more efficient, every railroad that rebuilt its domestic freight business through truck-rail partnerships, all of that moved faster because of what Hunt started in 1989. That is what it means to change an industry. Not just to participate in a trend, but to initiate one. Not just to ride a wave, but to be the reason the wave exists. At the company level, J.B. Hunt Transport continued to grow through the 1990s and into the 2000s, expanding beyond intermodal into dedicated contract services, integrated capacity solutions, and eventually full truckload operations that combined technology, network scale, and operational depth in ways that earlier versions of the company could not have imagined. The business that Hunt had started with 5 tractors and 7 trailers in 1969 had become one of the largest surface transportation companies in North America. But the numbers, as impressive as they are not the most important part of what J.B. Hunt built. Think about who Hunt was when he started. A man who left school at 11 years old. A man who worked on his uncle's farm, drove trucks, sold rice hulls, and tried a livestock sale barn that failed in its first year. A man who put $3,000 into a business and lost $20,000 in year 1, and then built it into the world's largest producer of poultry litter before deciding that was just the beginning. A man who entered the trucking industry not as an outsider with fresh ideas and venture capital but as someone who had driven the trucks himself and understood the work at the most fundamental level. That background did not hold him back. In many ways, it was the source of his most important advantages. He understood operational friction because he had experienced it personally. He knew what drivers needed because he had been one. He could see through the theoretical arguments about why intermodal was impractical because his instinct was always to test ideas against reality rather than against convention. He had grown up in a world where survival required seeing things clearly and acting on what he saw, not on what he wished were true. A lot of the most celebrated figures in American business history came from privilege, from established families, elite universities, existing networks of capital and connection. Their stories are real and often genuinely impressive. But Hunt's story represents something different. It represents the kind of intelligence that does not require credentials to function. The kind of strategic clarity that comes not from studying markets in a classroom but from living inside them, from feeling the friction in your own hands and deciding you are going to figure out a better way. He was not the most educated person in any room he walked into. He was often, by the evidence of what he built, the most perceptive. Johnny Bryan Hunt passed away on December 6, 2006, at the age of 79. He had been inducted into the Arkansas Business Hall of Fame. The company he founded was, at the time of his death, one of the largest transportation companies in the United States, with a market presence that extended across truckload, intermodal, and dedicated contract services, and a reputation in the freight industry that was built not on marketing but on what the company had actually demonstrated it could do. The tributes that followed his death focused, rightly, on the scale of what he had built. But scale was always the byproduct. The thing Hunt was actually doing, the thing that made him matter beyond his own balance sheet, was changing how the system worked. He saw that trucks and trains were being managed as competitors when they were structurally suited to be partners. He saw that the long-haul portion of freight movement was being handled in the most expensive possible way, not because nobody had noticed, but because nobody had built the commercial architecture to change it. He built that architecture. He absorbed the early losses and the operational complexity and the industry skepticism, and he held the line long enough for the model to prove itself. That is the first layer of his legacy. The practical, operational, industry-level layer. Intermodal freight is a standard tool of American supply chain management today. The containers you see riding on flat cars across the country's rail network, moving goods from port to warehouse to distribution center, that model, in its modern commercial form, runs on a foundation that J.B. Hunt helped pour. The second layer is the company itself. J.B. Hunt Transport Services is not just large. It is structurally significant, a platform that connects shippers with capacity across multiple modes, that uses technology to manage complexity at a scale that would have been unimaginable when Hunt was dispatching a handful of trucks from Northwest Arkansas. The culture of the company reflects something of its founders' instincts, an emphasis on operational discipline, on understanding the work at the ground level, on building systems that actually function rather than systems that look good in a presentation. The third layer is the hardest to quantify but perhaps the most important. Hunt's story is proof of something. Proof that the most consequential changes in how industries work do not always come from the most credentialed or the most connected people. They come from people who are close enough to the real problem to see it clearly and stubborn enough to hold their position while everyone around them argues for the status quo. They come from people who are willing to push two separate worlds toward each other and absorb the friction that comes from that collision, because they can see something on the other side of that friction that others cannot yet see. Most people look at an industry boundary, the line between two different systems, two different cultures, two different sets of established interests, and see a wall. A fact of how things are. A permanent feature of the landscape. Hunt looked at the boundary between trucking and rail and saw a problem waiting to be solved. A seam that was costing the entire American economy money, every single day, because two industries that needed each other had never found a way to act like it. He found the way. From rice hulls in Stuttgart, Arkansas, to a partnership that rewired the long-haul freight logic of the most powerful economy in the world. From a boy working in a sawmill at 11 to a man who sat across the table from a major American railroad and changed the terms of how goods move across a continent. That is not a story about luck, or timing, or being in the right place. That is a story about a very specific kind of intelligence, the intelligence that sees a broken system and refuses to accept that broken is permanent. The road, in every sense, is still open for that kind of intelligence. It always has been. It always will be. And if that story, the story of people who look at how industries work and decide they can work better, who find the seam between two established worlds and push until something new comes through, if that story interests you, then you are in the right place. This channel exists for exactly that. The real inside story of how freight, supply chain, and transportation actually work, and the people who had the vision to change them. Stay with us. There is more road ahead.